Welcome everybody to this first inaugural episode of Beyond Geopolitics, where I am very, very happy to be joined by Marty Sieff, my co-host, and our first guest, Pelle Neroth Taylor, who has been an accomplished journalist, Pelle, you've walked an amazing path in life as a filmmaker, as a journalist, as an editor. You've been published in the London Guardian, The Economist. Just your bio is the Times and New Scientist. It's quite something. And somewhere along the way, you decided to stand up and break from the mold of what was expected of you. I don't know what your story is, and I'd like to get that maybe at first before we jump into it. But today's show specifically, and I'm really happy to have Marty here with me, is going to fold in the work that you've been doing over the years. You've published a book. You're in the process of making a documentary on a certain figure who I didn't know very much about. I still don't know that much about, which is the purpose of the show. Called Dag Hammarskjold. And Dag is somebody who I didn't know that the United Nations, which has a lot of problems. I'm not a big fan of the UN, but at the same time, I oversimplified my idea of what the UN was. And when it was brought to my attention that a Secretary General of the UN was assassinated, that blew my mind. I had no idea that was even a thing. Now, Marty has also done a lot of work on this material, and we're living through a period right now of major historical change. It's the 80th Assembly General happening as we're having this conversation. So I figure it's a very auspicious time to have this conversation about, well, what is the UN? Who was Dag Hammarskjold? What brought your attention to this, and what brought you as a person into this unorthodox but extremely important way of analyzing deep politics?
Okay, well, I'll start. I mean, I spent part of my childhood in Sweden. My mum's Swedish, but I spent most of my time. I'm basically English, and I went through the English education system, and then I was floating around in British journalism for a number of years, but as a freelancer, editing at all these newspapers and so on. And I thought, well, I've got to find something, and I did a lot of science journalism, but science journalism requires you to, it's a hell of a lot of effort for not a lot of pay. I mean, you spent 3 weeks reading up on dark matter or something, and then you get one freelance article published for it. So I thought, well, let's find something that I can make, a subject I can make my own. And then I was also becoming increasingly irritated with British or Anglo journalism. It was quite self-satisfied, and I felt that it was a time. I mean, I've talked to a lot of people who've been on my show on TNT. When did you wake up? Not woke. When did you start realizing the media start lying about everything? And inside the system, I realized there's quite a lot of lies, and everything is quite haphazard. So I wanted to. I went to Sweden partly because I had a girlfriend, or I found a girlfriend, and then I wanted to find topics in Scandinavia which I could make my own because I spoke Swedish fluently, and I thought, well, this could be a niche, and then I could use that as a jumping off point, to cover other topics. And I'm glad I spent these last few years. So the quick of it is that Hammarskjold was a Swedish Secretary General, and I thought, well, that's an obvious thing. So I read a lot of literature with the intent of using him to sort of spread lessons that can be learned from him into the Anglo market. I found that sitting in Sweden, I mean, they've got quite good free speech laws. It gives you a perspective that you don't get if you're sitting in a competitive London and New York newsroom. And I've got a lot of peers working in London journalism. I mean, some of them are diplomatic editors and so on. And I don't envy them. I think they're living in a world of lies. And what I found is that a lot of them haven't shifted their views. They really believe what the Guardian writes. They really believe the New York Times. Swedish journalists are even worse. I mean, the Guardian and the New York Times are telling the lies. The Swedish idiots are believing the lies. They're sitting there like fanboys in Stockholm. I mean, terrible. And so they believe all this stuff I've written about Russia. So I'm very glad I've sat in Sweden. And it allows me also, because to have and I know your work, Matt, was also an eye-opener for me. I mean, I had eye-openers from many of my guests on TNT, and you, of course, were a co-host, because your book about the US Anglo conflict with Canada sort of in the middle, well, that opened up my eyes, because I came at that from a different direction, because we're taught on the special relationship, and the Brits are basically what 20th century historiography is the historiography of the Brits as the good guys and lots of other bad guys. And it so happens that all the dictatorships in the world seem to be hostile to good old England, who's always fighting the good fight. And with their Batman to Robin, who's Robin, who's Batman, we don't know. But the US and America and the Brits always fighting the good fights against evil brown-skinned dictators, But then there were two big stories I started researching as a result of my being in Sweden. I mean, there were given topics because I could read Swedish, and I was out, and a lot of Swedes know about them. And these are mysterious deaths of the Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme, and the mysterious deaths of the Swedish UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld. And maybe we could take Palme another time because it's more recent, but he's far less well known. And Hammarskjöld has ramifications. We could talk about the UN system, but it's just as a mystery, so separately and relevantly and everything. But just as an assassination or an accident is interesting, and it was committed. He died over British territory. So I wrote a book about Hammarskjöld, and I wrote a book about Palme, and all trails lead to London, you know. And so if this becomes common knowledge, it's not the Brits taking on those evil Russians who do bad things, you know, or those brown-skinned dictators that are down in the south somewhere, that Dago Galtiero or that wop over there, or that darky, or that guy with those funny sunglasses and secret police. They killed leaders of the two most profoundly, most pacifist, peaceful, bit boring sometimes democracy in the world. I mean, what does this say about Britain's what does it do to Britain's reputation? Swedes haven't done anyone any harm, except for the fact that they were sometimes a bit superior and sort of arrogant, and we're better than you. That's the worst you could say about them. Sorry, Martin, you wanted to jump in?
No, first of all, you're in full flow, and it's an education, and I don't mean to interrupt at all.
No, okay, I'll carry on. Because Martin, you're older than both of us, you know, so you might have been a journalist during this time. I mean, I think you're too young for Hammarskjöld, but certainly for Palme, you might have been UPI or something, or even in Eastern Europe at that time, for all I know. Anyway, yeah.
First of all, I actually have more on Hammarskjöld than I do on Palme. But on Palme, too, I spent several years as a crime desk editor, which basically meant a glorified copy editor. But I was working with some of the best investigative journalists in the business in Ireland at the time during the height of the Civil War in Ireland, quaintly called Troubles. And my father, before me, was actually an officer in Irish military intelligence during World War II. And his unit was tasked with suppressing Nazi intelligence, the Abwehr, in Ireland at the time. They flatly refused to cooperate with the British for the reasons you have just vividly given, Pelle, but they worked very closely and successfully and warmly with the Office of Strategic Services, the US intelligence service at the time, which Matt, of course, is a world expert on, was then purged and closed to clear the way for the much more fascist and much more truly sinister CIA afterwards. So I had background both in my family and in my early journalistic experience in covering murder, in covering crime, in working with police officers, in listening to police officers, in having police and intelligence officers who were respected sources, who would leak to me and my colleagues and friends, when of course it was in their interest to do so as well. And of course, we were happy to play ball. We got the stories out of it. But I had this background, first of all. But secondly, I came into the business in 1977. I really became serious when I went back to Ireland and went full-time on the Belfast expletive-deleted Telegraph. I must say that because I took a blood oath never to refer to that outfit without an expletive in the middle of it. But I was there for 4.5 years, and it was an education. But the key point was this. When I came to Washington, I was on the Washington Times, and I was a friend of a legendary journalist, Andrew Borowick, who should not be confused with his son, also Andrew Borowick, who became a very eminent foreign correspondent, and I hopefully still is so, in London at the time. I believe Andy Jr., who I did not know personally, was with the Times. But his father was a close friend of mine for many years, and I succeeded him as chief foreign correspondent of the Washington Times. Now, Andy Borowick was the Associated Press bureau chief in Salisbury, which I believe is now Harare, which is where I believe Hammarskjold was flying to. And he lost his job over it, but not for any conspiracy reasons at all. But it is an important insight into what happened there. Andy was already one of the most respected journalists in the AP. He had been the deputy, the runner-up for the Pulitzer Prize the previous year for his coverage of the Algerian War of Independence for the AP. And here he is in Salisbury, now Harare, and he files a story saying UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjold landed here last night on the latest stage of his shuttle mission to bring peace in the Congo. Of course, it did not happen. He filed the story before the plane landed or was shut down because the gossip is, which of course I cannot verify, but I thought the world of Andy. And he was one of the greatest journalists as well as the most delightful human beings I ever knew. But the story is he had a girlfriend in Salisbury at the time. And, so he filed his story in advance, which is quite common routine practice when you're either a stringer or a correspondent out there and you're covering routine stuff. Mm-hmm. In other words, nobody expected this to happen. First point. Secondly, as far as I know, Andy never suspected foul play in the conventional sense, and nor did anyone else at the time. And this, of course, was exactly what happened with the Kennedy assassination. The conventional story is put out immediately, and it immediately grasps the imagination of hundreds of millions of people around the world. So they have the moral high ground. It's Newton's laws of motion in physics put into psychological practice. In other words, no, go ahead, please.
No, I was going to say we'll take the Hammarskjold story because I was taking two simultaneously. So we'll take Palmer for another time. We'll just focus on Hammarskjold for this because it's the 80th anniversary. So I'll just back up to 1945. The United Nations was started in San Francisco, but it was basically the Allies who'd fought one. And if you look at the propaganda for the Allies in the spring and summer of 1945, they didn't talk about the Allies. They talked about the United Nations. And they had all these flags, but because by the spring of 1945, the Brits and the French and the Americans had been joined by countries like Argentina and Brazil and all sorts of, I think, in the last weeks of the Reich, lots of countries joined the campaign against the Germans, And so the British in particular thought of the United Nations as basically the Russians and the Americans and the Brits running the world for the benefit of mankind. And the other countries were going to be part of it, but basically it was going to be like the wartime alliance in peace. And what happened was, of course, the Russians fell out, but the Brits thought they could still run it along with the Americans. And it's the death of Hammarskjold is intimately connected to the decline of the British Empire and the rise of America. And in a way, he was squeezed in this kind of almost a proxy war between the Americans and the British. We think of Britain as being a second-rate country now, but then they thought of themselves as one of the big three, definitely, and maybe had some claim to it. And they still had an empire that was huge and all that, right? And they had the nuclear bomb. They'd invented the computer. They invented the first jet plane. They had the first nuclear power plant. So they're really doing big things, And then Suez came in 56, and that was a big shock. But what happened was that they had a UN Secretary General who was basically a Norwegian who was called Trygve Lie, and he was kind of a bit obstreperous towards the Allies. And we thought he's too independent, so we'll get somebody who's completely pliant. And they found Hammarskjold. He was actually recommended by the French because he spoke fluent French and loved French poetry. And he'd been working on the Marshall Plan, and he spent a lot of time in Paris. And they thought, well, and because the French were pushing him, thinking he'll be a friend of the Francophonie, the Brits and America said, well, we don't know much about him. He's Swede. He's probably okay. But what happened was when Hammarskjold came into office, he turned it into his organization. And so he pushed the Brits out, basically. And that's what it comes down to. He always had to keep, he was a diplomat. He was in a negative way, you could say he was a man of power. He was interested in power for the greater good of mankind, if you like. But he did use the UN as a tool. And what happened was he always had to keep the Americans on board, probably partly out of conviction. He lived in New York. He grew to love New York. I think he was homosexual, and he got that free liberal life. He was really into this 1950s modernism, America, the cocktail culture and the jazz and all that. Really like a symbol of America in the 1950s. And he loved it. He was at the UN was talked about all the time. It was a repository for mankind's hope. And he built this fantastic, he oversaw the construction and the introduction of this fantastic UN building, which is like a shrine to like late 1950s America in a way. And there's that Scandinavian American joint sort of cultural project, because there was, I think it was the Finns were very famous for their architects. There's that TWA terminal at Kennedy was Saarinen, yes. I think his name was. And Sweden and Scandinavia were really popular among American liberals at the time, because they saw as countries that were kind of leading the way in architecture, culture, sex, modern social democratic values and all that. So there was a kind of love affair between Scandinavia and America, and Hammarskjöld represented. So he became more and more. Didn't speak a lot, and he spoke a sort of funny Swinglish, but he was very, very effective operator. And he actually introduced these things, and he was a media figure. So, I mean, from coming out of nowhere, from a small country of 8 million people, from an organization that didn't have a past, he became a figure of all the newsreels. I mean, Dag, the man who's going to solve the world's problems. I mean, every single newsreel had a guy getting off this DC-3 or DC-6 plane back from another trouble spot. The Swede, the ice cool, unflappable Swede. Leave it to Dag. And in this kind of Cold War, which is as bad as this Cold War, people were looking for security, and they saw it in him. And he was actually, I mean, the Suez Crisis, if you remember, is when the Brits and the French and the Israelis tried to seize the Suez Canal, and they were lying to the Americans about this. And the Americans and the Russians tamped down on it, and the Brits couldn't. I mean, it was basically, I mean, it was a lifeline of the British Empire. And when the Americans said, we're going to cut off your loans, we're going to cut off your oil, I mean, Eisenhower had worked with the British, wasn't fooled by the British, and he had no qualms about shutting them down. And then the Brits said, well, let us have our security guarantee force in Suez, and he said, no, the Egyptians are not going to let you do that, because you're belligerent. You're going to get by the backside that you didn't get on the front by attacking them directly. So what happened was Hammarskjöld said, let's put some Scandinavian UN troops in. So this concept of the UN blue helmets was formed. And, they were using US Marine helmets dunked in blue paint, and they flew down there. And so this concept that in a world of clashing egos and clashing powers, the blue helmets would be something that would stop situations from escalating, basically. Yeah. And it was symbolic, but it seemed to work, because the Brits were out, the French were out, and you had these small countries in the UN blue helmets. And so that concept expanded very quickly in Hammarskjöld.
So would you say that Dag was largely providing a space for the colonialized, like the new nationalists, like Nasser, who were
exactly.
So he's creating a space for them to breathe, to move,
and keeping the superpowers apart, and keeping the fading superpowers or failing colonial powers apart. Basically, a neutral umpire, and there's a term in cricket: an umpire is the referee, and the British said, "Oh, Dag Hammarskjöld, the umpire on whom the sun never sets," right? Because it's the usual saying is the British Empire on which the sun never sets. So the Russians were not, because the Russians had the Soviets had their zone of influence. The Americans were growing fast and fitting and adapting imperial habits of the British in a way. The Brits and the French were in decline, and they knew it. And they blamed a lot of it to this upstart from Sweden, which hadn't even fought in the Second World War. These neutral cowards, these people didn't have any medals on their chests, who preaching new values of pacifism and love and all that. And he came, and they really didn't like him. You can read this in the British diplomatic papers. It's full of sneering arrogance towards him, and he wasn't married and so on. And he looked a bit weird, had this funny Swinglish accent. Anyway, so I think there's a lot of bad will towards him. And then what happened was, sorry, yeah.
No, you're right. Go on.
Yeah. So, but he, in my book, I talk about he resolved during various creative solutions to neutralize several Cold War conflicts, because he said all these countries are coming into their independence now. They're being torn apart immediately because Americans take one side and the Soviets take another, so they never get a chance to develop on their own. So his principle was, he said, well, Sweden was never occupied. Sweden is a 1,200-year-old country which has never been occupied by a foreign power, and they've been left alone to sort out their own problems. So we'll do that. We'll keep out the Cold War so that they can the local nationalist forces can resolve their differences. So it might be local communists and local business party, but if the Cold War is kept out of it, they can do their own thing, right? And so he applied this method to several countries, more or less successfully, but he let it be known that that was going to be the way going forward. And when Kennedy came into office in January 1961, I mean, Kennedy was very much in favor of third world independence.
Yes,
He was one of the
yes.
few senators who spoke out for Algeria in 1958. So he was completely on the same page as Hammarskjöld. I mean, he and Adlai Stevenson was even more idealistic than Kennedy. And these new frontiersmen, there were half a dozen, I mean, maybe 10 people, Arthur Schlesinger and other people, who were in the State Department at the time and very, very influential. They were idealistic. They were young. They wanted, I guess they wanted an American empire in a way, but they wanted it done in a nice way. They hated the Cold War. And so when Hammarskjöld said, we can't keep the Cold War out of Europe, but let's try and keep the Cold War out of as many other places as possible. Yeah. They kind of went along with that. They really listened to him.
Yeah, I would say, like, in regards to the New Frontiers approach that JFK came to power in on that ticket, if that was the message, we're looking at creating new frontiers. When you listen to the messaging and the policies behind that idea, what it meant was that the concepts of FDR's four freedoms, freedom from want, a freedom from war, freedom from secret police, for all humankind, would be the objectives, economic and foreign policy wise, of the new John F. Kennedy United States, as far as providing influence not through military imposition onto weak countries or exploitation of them, the way the British Empire had done, or all empires had done, but rather through providing the means for those countries to economically develop themselves and to do trade and expand influence in that manner, which is much more befitting of a human civilization than the other thing. So the fact that him and Dag were seeing eye to eye on that way of thinking is very interesting.
And the thing is about Dag Hammarskjold, or Dag, I'll call him Dag, was that he came from a small, he could always be a front man for the Americans, because the Americans, so there was a kind of, the UN was still mostly funded by the Americans, but if a guy from a white but European neutral country that Sweden never had an empire. Sweden was one of those few European countries who neither been occupied nor had an empire. I think they had some colonies in Germany and one in the West Indies, but they were the good white man, if you like, so they went down, and I fought a lot of battles with Swedes because you're so arrogant, you think you're the best in the world, but they did go down to Africa as aid workers, and blacks said, oh, you're the good white man because you never colonized us. So they did have a lot of goodwill. The Americans did do, because they were not then known to be pushing their weight around, but it was good for Kennedy to push Hammarskjöld in front of him, and of course he was. And what happened in 1960-61 was, I think the British and the French even more so, I mean, thought that their colonies were all becoming independent in 1959-60. So the UN grew from a body of 50 nations to 150 nations or something. So the voting shifted very quickly. But the thing is, the French wanted to keep their colonies on side, and the Brits did it too. And what Hammarskjöld and Kennedy were doing was were saying, no, you're independent. You don't have to listen to your colonial masters anymore. You're sitting in this. You have your new national airline now. You have your new currency, and now you've got your seat in the UN. Where Upper Volta has the same power as the United States. It's all BS, of course, but I mean, it gave a lot of self-confidence to these new countries. So the UN. And now it's completely dead, of course, but it was a repository for people's hopes in a time, and it was in the news almost every day. And the Brits, the British Foreign Office, with its worldwide empire, they were looking at this and saying, who the hell is this guy? And this is not the alliance, the United Nations we envisaged this. We were going to be one of the major powers, one of three or something. We're seeing these new upstart powers, and this guy who's come from a country we've never heard of, he was supposed to take orders, and he's not, and he's mussing us out. He's mussing out the Americans. I mean, the Americans are getting friendly with this guy, and we're not getting friendly with the Americans. The Americans are shunning us, and we wanted to be the senior advisors to the Americans. So there is that sense, I'm exaggerating a little bit, that no, Kennedy wasn't. Yeah, Kennedy wasn't as he's Irish, of course, And 2 or 3, when he was talking about the Algerians and the blacks getting their independence, he says, well, we were the blacks 3 generations ago of the British Empire. So it's deep in the Kennedy mythology, this hostility to the British Empire, if you like. So he understood the yearning for freedom and independence of these countries. So it was totally, he was like in 1960 total ideology of the later 60s that I suppose we take for granted now. He was really onto that early, and I think what happened in 1960 was 61. In 1960, Congo, the biggest state in Africa, got its independence from Belgium, and the country immediately fractured into several parts. I mean, it's not really realistic for some of these African countries. I mean, the curse of these African countries is they split according to their imperial masters' rule rather than under ethnic reasons. Exactly. I mean, it's ridiculous. These countries, there are no roads in Congo, so these tribespeople didn't relate anyway. There was this pro-Soviet part, a pro-Western part, and so on. And both Kennedy and Hammarskjold worked very hard to try and glue this country back together. Because if Congo split up, all the other African countries would split up too, and they would all be attracted to communism. And both Kennedy and Hammarskjold saw social democracy, if you like, which was what was had in Scandinavia, as a moderate, to capture people's will for equality. Is much better to have social democracy or some kind of democracy, if you like, rather than hardcore communism the Soviets offered. So they were both on the same page with that, and nationalism. And what happened was that the Congo Civil War it broke out at about the same time as the Berlin crisis came to a head. And now that was the most dangerous crisis of the Cold War. And we forget that when we talk about the Cuba crisis, because basically West Berlin was this enclave inside East Germany. And Khrushchev said, we're going to take back West Berlin if you don't turn it into a free city and move your troops out. So, like we have in Ukraine now, we have an immovable force, irresistible force that meets an immovable object. There seems to be no room for compromise, or there seems to be no room for compromise in 61. Kennedy said, we're not going to pull our troops out of West Berlin. There are about 6,000 people, French, British, and American. And the Soviets said, no, well, I mean, we won World War II. We want that back. We're going to turn it into a free city without any soldiers at all. And if you don't do that, we're going to recognize East Germany, because East Germany was not then officially recognized. And the East Germans, who were very, very much more hardline than the Soviets, said, we're going to close the borders. So we're going to isolate West Berlin from the west of Germany. And that means war, basically, because the Germans said, because NATO said, well, we're going to drive our tanks through, because they have this Autobahn from east to Berlin. And so for a couple of months in 1961, there's this complete standoff where the East Germans said, okay, as soon as we're recognized, and the dates line was set for autumn of 1961, we're going to stop NATO from coming in. And NATO said, we're not going to stop. So summer of 1961 was a time when people were completely convinced that there was going to be a war. And it was Kennedy's baptism of fire, just been elected in January 61. And the thing that I'll finish up here, the official history says, Kennedy was a hardliner about it, and he faced down the Soviets. The truth is, he struck a secret deal with Hammarskjold to turn. One of the suggestions was to turn Berlin into the UN's new headquarters, and the second, which is possibly a more realistic option, is to turn West Berlin's garrison over to the United Nations. It would be garrisoned by blue helmets. Now,
really?
Yeah. Now, if Hammarskjold was going to resolve the Congo crisis before he was going to do this, because it would have been the UNGA, United Nations General Assembly, in 1961, last week of September 1961, Kennedy and Hammarskjold were set to talk about these things at the UNGA, this fantastic new plan. And it was the beginning of a much expanded rights for the UN, because both the Americans and the Soviets have been talking for some time about it's called the Zorin-McCloy plan, where the UN would take over, replace national armies. Just Google it, it's there. But it's one of those initiatives that died. It's the most dramatic initiative ever in the Cold War. And the countries would only have police forces, but there would be an international military and international disarmament, and a huge plan. And John McCoy, he was a neocon. I mean, he was not a softie by any means. So the UN, this was kind of, if Hammarskjold fixed this problem with Berlin and he fixed the problem with Congo, then he'd be in a very good position to be basically peace emperor of the world or something. Anyway, he went down to Congo to resolve the intractable negotiation between the pro-Soviet side. You might have heard of this word Katanga. Katanga was the southernmost part of Congo. They had the uranium, and they had they were close to Rhodesia geographically, so they had a lot of English speakers there manning the mines. That was backed by the British and the Belgians. And then you had the northern part of Congo, which was supported by the Soviets. He was going to bring them all into United States of Congo, as it were. The Soviet side, the pro-Soviets had already said yes. The central government, which was neutral in Leopoldville, had always said yes. And all Hammarskjold needed to do was to fly down to Congo and bring back the Chombe, the sort of the Zelensky of his time, an absolutely impossible man. But I can kind of see his point, because he was Katanga was run by whites basically, and relatively successful, whereas the rest of Africa was run by blacks and not successful, put it bluntly. And they feared that this was going to go to hell as well. So he was very resistant. And Hammarskjold was going to fly down to Ndola, which is on the border with the Congo, but actually in northern Rhodesia, hence your thing about Salisbury. And it was a British-run airport, modern equipment and so on. 20 Royal Rhodesian Air Force fighters, modern jet fighters, on the runway, ready to take off. His DC-6 was flying over after midnight, arrived from Leopoldville. Was going to do the big pair turn to come around and land, and then it crashed in the hills behind. And then it was a closed flight into terrain. That's what the Rhodesian, also known, or the British accident investigators said. But I mean, books and
what did they say? What's the official?
They
cause
said it was
of
a
the plane
controlled
crash?
flight into terrain. That they did the pair turn and they came in too low, and they didn't see there was a hill just before, and they crashed into that because it wasn't lit up. But there's been a lot of investigations. I mean, these guys, the Swedish pilots of the DC-6, were veteran pilots. They'd flown into that many times before. And witness testimonies, what the Rhodesian crash testimonies had, they were all these black charcoal burners, who actually lived in kilns outside, slept next to their kilns out in the bush. And they'd seen two smaller aircraft circle the area for a long time, waiting for Hammarskjöld's plane to come in, and they shot at it and it crashed. And so there are lots of and then a witness. So in the decades that have come, investigative journalists have kind of torpedoed or destroyed the old theory. One book says that they interviewed both a white South African, a musician actually, who was playing in a local band, and he was driving back on his scooter, and he saw two Land Rovers with white mercenaries, drive up to the plane and shoot it up so that it actually burnt, and then they pulled Hammarskjöld's body out so that it's actually pristine, and they were speaking Afrikaans or something, and there's been it's sort of like the JFK. I mean,
Exactly.
5, 10, 50 books have been written about it, and there's some people who say it was still an accident, and other people say no. But the UN actually did an official inquiry starting back in 2015 under the Swedish government's called on by the Swedish government, and it's been producing reports 2 or 3 years, without which more and more clearly indicate that it wasn't an accident, but the rapporteur doesn't spell it out. I guess he doesn't have the political backing for it. So the report disappears into the UN system, so you can actually download it. It's there, and it's not that easy to find. You have to know a little bit, and you can read it, and you think, well, yeah, okay, they've picked up what the investigative journalists have been saying over the decades, but they don't say, let's do something. And that's because the big powers don't want it. They say that the British and Americans haven't cooperated, because what they could do. The British had air traffic control, which was recorded. They had cracked the United Nations crypto machine, the secret messages that Hammarskjold was sending, and the Americans had 2 DC-3s parked on the tarmac with the engines running, meaning that they were actually recording or had radio contact with the plane and anything else. So there was certainly situational awareness of what was going on above the skies of Ndola. Yeah. Now, if these 2 light planes were buzzing around there and perhaps trying to contact the plane or whatever, why didn't the British planes take off and shoot them down or to try to find out? Anyway, the fact that the British and the Americans have never allowed this information to be public means, well,
yes.
What are they hiding? So
I got a
that's
question for you.
basically.
I actually got a question. In this case, I'll throw it at Marty. But you had mentioned to me, Marty, once that the South African apartheid regime might have played a nefarious role within this operation. Is that something that you could elaborate on? And Pele, is that something that you picked up in your conversation? I'll throw it at Marty first.
I don't think it's. I don't think in this particular one. I think that was
No?
a false trail. Actually, I mean
Oh,
they're
yeah.
Actually,
responsible for other things, but yeah,
may I?
Hmm.
yeah.
I agree with you very much on that, but I think there's a much more obvious and clear trail, and that is what you have pointed out yourself: the complicity of the white colonialist government of Rhodesia itself at the time. The Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland was run by Sir Roy Walensky, who was a very unusual fellow. He didn't come from conventional British aristocratic background. He was the son of Eastern European Jewish immigrants to Southern Africa, who became more anti-black racist than all the traditional Boer and white settler anti-black racists. And he was a pugnacious, violent man. He had been a boxer, and he hated Dag Hammarskjold personally. He was a macho fellow, kids, grandkids, a quite successful boxer in his time. And he regarded everything you say, Pele, about Hammarskjold and the reasons the British and the French and the Americans hated him. He wasn't a real man because he was gay. Sweden had been neutral, this, that, and the other. All this contempt fed very strongly into this. And therefore, white Rhodesia had a very small white population, and its government at the time was very effective within that country. There was no unrest at the time. The white community, including the military and security services, were not like America has been for the past 60 or 70 years, all these hundreds of thousands of people working in enormous bureaucracies. In other words, if there were Rhodesian military aircraft, not South African, but Rhodesian military aircraft involved, the prime minister would almost have, especially that prime minister, almost certainly did know about it. First point.
Okay.
Second point, a very crucial point that we see in the assassination of the location of the assassinations of Dr. King, Robert Kennedy, and most of all JFK itself. And that is, and I think we even see it in the Charlie Kirk assassination recently. When there is a political context, when these things are planned in advance, it is always done on safe ground where the police forces and the politicians who run the state or the city in question are at the very minimum sympathetic to the people involved. There is no risk of being caught by the local police or security forces or the military intervening to stop it because they are in on the action or are standing side passively. And what has Pele told us here? Where did the assassination take place? When the plane was about to land at Ndola. It was in Rhodesian airspace. It was not shot down. It did not crash over Katanga. And again, this is a very interesting point, because if there is pilot error, you would expect it to be, and again, these are very, as Pele said, these are very experienced pilots. You would expect it to be over areas where there is no close flight control, where there are no aircraft coming in to protect. What do we have here? We have the very forces of the Royal Rhodesian, notice Royal Rhodesian, still part of the British Empire, Air Force, supposedly providing protection, when they are actually protecting the assassins or carrying out the assassination themselves. Everything is the opposite of what you assume it ought to be. But this fits the classic patterns of assassinations there. Finally, third point. This is also crucial because it starts a killing spree. The CIA is decapitating what it regards as the radical left leadership of the world, both in America and around the world. The killing starts with the assassination of Dag Hammarskjold, as Pele documents. What do we have afterwards? Within 2 years, the pro-American ally, not quite a puppet, but an embarrassment by now to the United States, who is the prime minister of the president of South Vietnam, is killed in a coup. President Kennedy had signed off on the coup, but had been assured that Diem would not be killed. He was shocked to learn that the assassination had taken place. Back in Congo, the prime minister of Congo, and the idealist who really believed in democracy for Africa and for his own nation, Patrice Lumumba, is viciously assassinated.
Well, he's killed first, right? Isn't he?
Exactly.
He dies, in January of 1961.
Yes, you're right.
And
Kennedy either goes along with it or is persuaded to go along with it, probably doesn't know fully what's going on. Kennedy is a young and inexperienced president, still a young and inexperienced president when this happened. And remember also, Kennedy becomes more moderate and responsible later, but he comes in, the new frontier was big on special operations, dirty war. Robert Kennedy was deeply involved in ridiculous plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. They had Maxwell Taylor as one of them, who is a former senior military officer in the U.S. Army, heavily decorated in World War II, I think around the 82nd Airborne Division, either that or the 101st, I think the 82nd. But when the Kennedys come in, their people, and they are macho men. They despise Adlai Stevenson as a wimp. At first, they are very much in favor of violent solutions. They change on this. The president especially changes on this. He grows, he mellows, he becomes a statesman. And that signs his death warrant. Because the guy behind the killing spree is, of course, the head of the CIA, Allen Dulles, who Kennedy removes as head of the CIA, but who still remains de facto head of the secret state, even though he has been officially decapitated from that position. As early as 1961 or 62, the President of the United States no longer has effective executive control over the Central Intelligence Agency and the secret states operating within the United States. And this is central to understanding the assassination of 1963, because President Kennedy comes to a full awareness of this, is determined to expose this situation to the American public, but of course is playing for time until he is re-elected with a wide margin of support, which everyone knows he's going to get in 1964. So he must be eliminated before this happens. But I add one more point 4, and this is absolutely crucial. What Pelle talks about, first, I think his mastery of the subject is superb. And of crucial importance. And the importance of what he is tackling is even more important because of what follows. Harold Macmillan is Prime Minister of Britain from 1957 to 63. And he is actually, although a Conservative Party leader, relatively speaking, like Eisenhower in America at the same time, surprisingly enlightened for his time. He does decolonize Africa, at least in theory. He takes care to try and keep British financial control over all the wealth of Africa, of course. But he sets up democratic systems throughout former British Africa, all the way from Kenya and Uganda in the north down to the Federation of what is then called Rhodesia and Nyasaland in the south.
Yeah.
Macmillan approves this, but Macmillan is toppled from office in 1963. And President Kennedy is assassinated shortly after that on November 22nd, 1963. Within the next 2 years, specifically in 1965, 6 democratic post-colonial governments in Africa are toppled in quick succession by military coups, and the story, which is put out by the British media and is swallowed by the entire world, and I am old enough to remember reading this, and God help me, I believed it at the time. And that is these young, immature black regimes, and it was all Macmillan's fault. They weren't capable of running democracy for themselves. Nonsense. That is not what happened. That is the big lie. The agency was deeply involved in all of it. And British interests very much too. The secret states in Britain. And the irony is the Labour government of Harold Wilson was much more complicit in the CIA toppling of democracy throughout Africa than the Conservative government of Harold Macmillan had been before it. When I am, one last point, I am so old, when I was 19 and a young first-year student at Oxford, I actually got myself, without realizing it, on the MI5 watch list at the time, because I went to a Labour Party meeting in Oxford University, which was being addressed by the then Foreign Secretary Michael Stewart, the Joe Biden of his day, a vile and contemptible little nonentity who everybody loved as such a sweet and wonderful and gentlemanly fellow. And he deliberately presided over the starving to death of 3 million people, including 1 million children of the Igbo nation in Biafra, in what is now Nigeria, in order to protect the oil interests of British Petroleum. And I asked him in person, to his face, why he did this. And his answer amazed me, because I thought he would be like a Lyndon Johnson or a J. Edgar Hoover. He would order me locked up, or he would slap my face. He'd be a big macho guy. You know, how dare you ask this? He wasn't like that at all. He was rather like Sullivan and Blinken when they pushed the genocide of the Ukrainian people over the last 3 years. Meek, sweet, mild-mannered, and it wasn't an act. That's what floored me at age 19. It took me years to process, decades to process. It wasn't an act. This repulsive, evil, genocidal little turd had carried out a war crime comparable to the Holocaust or Stalin's worst excesses. And he really thought of himself as a sweet, moral, Labour Party, holier than thou, liberal, high-minded internationalist, while he was doing everything he was told to do.
Yeah.
All of this is a consequence of 2 killings. It is a consequence of the assassination of Dag Hammarskjold, and it is a consequence of the assassination of President Kennedy. Because only after President Kennedy is murdered can all the democracies of Africa be toppled by the agency and the British allies, and the blame is put on the African peoples themselves when they did not do it.
Yeah. No, that's something that strikes me, and it's frustrating that so many people have drank this Kool-Aid, this narrative that the darker skinned people cannot govern themselves because, look, we've poured trillions of dollars of aid over decades and decades, and they're still impoverished and all of these things. And so there's this like baked in subtle racism that kind of,
it's not subtle, it's racism.
Oh, it gets loud. Yeah, it gets loud. But seemingly normal non-racist people end up adopting this, and unfortunately many Africans and people who have been victimized and colonialized end up also in many cases believing this stuff too. And I've encountered many inferiority complexes amongst those who have been abused, thinking, oh well, we just cannot govern ourselves. I guess there's a problem with our culture. So you get this issue. But the reality, when you look at the work of Pele and of you, Marty, as well, there's actually this hidden but very active top-down hand, this agency that's sabotaging everybody every step of the way. And every time that there's an honest leader that emerges, both within Africa but also internationally, like Dag or JFK, who actually wants to resist it, they get artificially cut down. Their murder is covered up. And I got a question for you, Pele. But before I ask that question, 1 second, I'm just going to do this because my computer's about to die. Just realized. So my question for you, Pele, is now that you've mapped out the figure of Dag and his work, his efforts, his vision, how he was cut down far too early in tandem with these other leaders, JFK soon thereafter, Lumumba, Clive, and many others. Was there any other redeeming efforts after his death to bring the UN into some positive, to have the UN play a positive role in the aspirations of humanity to develop mutually, to break free of empire and what have you? Or would you say that Dag represented the last real effort for that in our lifetimes?
My research kind of stopped there, and I think that U Thant, his successor, was I mean, Martin could probably tell more about him, but he was this Burmese guy, and he's very active in the. So I won't say, but in my book, as it were, I'm mythologizing it a little bit because maybe it certainly didn't last through the Waldheim period. I mean, this former SS officer who became UN Secretary General in 1971, and then that was exposed in the mid 70s. So I'd say by the mid 70s, it really lost its reputation, maybe, but it never. I won't say that it had lost everything but it was definitely the high point of the
Yes.
UN. I don't think anyone would disagree with you. You could go to the UN building right now. You could go to a cocktail party, which is probably taking place this evening, and say who was the greatest UN Secretary General. And I'd say 80% of them would say Dag Hammarskjöld, and maybe 20% would
Yes.
probably say Kofi Annan. I mean, the square in New York is called Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza.
Mm.
The library is called Hammarskjöld. Everything is as if like Dag left it. You know that the Swedish designed Room of Peace, which is like a sort of multi-denominational place of prayer. It's got Swedish fingerprints all over it, so it's still like a shrine to him. It feels like a sort of the high point of let's sort of a naive American power, the power for good, the idea that America, broken free from the was at the high point of its reputation before the Vietnam War and before everything sort of seemed to go to hell with Watergate and everything. Late 1950s, everybody looked to New York. The UN is a shrine still to that more optimistic world, and it hasn't lived up to it. It's like a shell of its former self. And I think I think there are more books to be written about this. I mean, I didn't go. I should have gone to archives in America. I should have talked to relatives and descendants of Adlai Stevenson and Kennedy. I should have gone to the Kennedy Library. I didn't have the resources to do that. So
Exactly.
in those 2 weeks, 6th of September, when Kennedy was about to offer Berlin, turn it into UN capital, to his actual speech on the 25th, where he said, "We will remember Dag here today. But he dies, but his mission lives on." You know, he basically taking on the mantle of Dag Hammarskjold. There's a lot we don't know about those 220 days. I mean, you can Google it now. That the decision to go to Berlin, it's in the FRUS papers, the American State Department papers, which are all online. But you don't get the subtlety of the discussions, because at some point Kennedy might have realized he must have cut his losses to protect the British or the whatever. By the way, think about Macmillan. I think another big question mark is how much did Macmillan know? Was it the Rhodesians? The Rhodesians, of course they did it. Of course they did it because they saw Hammarskjold as a threat to them. Fine. I think, what was the name of that foreign secretary? Douglas Home? He was very right-wing, very anti-black.
Yes.
I think he knew, for instance. I think maybe Lord Lansdowne, who went down there. There was, I don't know if you know, the Duncan Sandys and Churchill's cousin and brother-in-law, and there's a cabal. There's the Rhodesian Club or something, the Monday Club. I can't remember what their name was, but there was a strong Rhodesian lobby. People who'd fought in the SOE in Second World War, people who fought with Churchill, they were still and they thought Hammarskjold, again, he was this idiot from Sweden which hadn't fought the war, and they weren't going to give away the most successful white colony in Africa to some upstart with his blacks, you know. So that was very strongly the feeling there. So in the Tory party, although Macmillan was a reformist, there were people who were total diehards for white Rhodesia. And I don't know who knew and who was part of it and who knew later and so on. Macmillan might have been innocent, and he was quite keen on a solution to Berlin, which included the UN, actually. So maybe he didn't know. Maybe he was blindsided by it as well. By the way, and it wasn't Kennedy who was involved in Lumumba. It was he was abducted and flown down to be killed in Katanga, of all places, in Eisenhower's last week in office, the 13th of January, because they wanted to do it before Kennedy came into power, and Kennedy might lead to release him, you know. And,
Exactly.
Well, I remember JFK was very, very angry when he got news that Lumumba had been killed, because Kennedy was very much looking forward to meeting with Petrus Lumumba very early on, at the same time that he was preparing the meeting with Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. The same that Lumumba was part of that Pan-African industrial revival movement that JFK was so inspired to help out with. So yeah, he was pissed, and I fascinated to know who actually killed him and how that was carried out.
Just to say, if I could talk about the UN today, I mean, we're now moving into a world of BRICS and multipolarity and so on. And if by the way, the French were just as hostile to the black powers. The Brits and the CI kill people in English Africa, but the blacks kill 2 or 3 or 4 leaders in their part of Africa, you know.
Yes.
But we don't know that in the Anglophone world, so we tend to give the French a free pass. But they were even more hawkish towards their Africans, as it were. But anyway, the thing is, I wonder, with this rise of BRICS, multipolarity is tripping off everyone's tongues. We're going to revisit this period of the early 1960s, because it's interesting. I mean, China, of course, wasn't in the UN, and China was under Mao and still out of the game, as it were. But India was playing a very big role, one of Hammarskjöld's biggest supporters. And Nehru was a very great friend of Africa. I mean, I don't know if he spent his youth in South Africa. I can't remember. But anyway, the Indians were kind of throwing their weight around and sending a lot of troops into the Blue Helmet structure. So, and people like Kwame Nkrumah and Lumumba, these were household names. People talked about them. They were the new heroes of the new 1960s. Something fresh about them. And of course, the old imperial powers that be saw these guys as threats, and I'm just wondering if people saying, well, what kind of world order are we going to have? Are we all going to be at daggers drawn with each other? That is, if we don't all get killed in war.
Exactly.
Or will we have some kind of structure that can allow us to compete peacefully or whatever, resolve those things?
Well, that's the thing that strikes me as well right now is that you have a sort of revival of the spirit of Nkrumah and Lumumba with the figure of Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso.
Exactly.
There is a Pan-African revivalism. There's great projects in Ethiopia. The Great Man-Made Water Reservoir is the biggest hydroelectric dam that in many ways parallels the Volta River Dam that John F. Kennedy helped build in Ghana back in the 60s. Now this is even bigger, but it's the same spirit. And it seems like you have countries now hearing on the scene, China being a big one, that is carrying or picking up the torch of wanting to assist as a strong power in the developmental aspirations of abused people. And China being a big player in the BRICS, in the SCO, definitely carries a lot of weight also at the UN. And it seems like there's a battle over what the UN what role is it going to play in this emerging new system? And is it going to be in the service of the interests who build these great leaders in the 60s? Is it going to be something that's going to be a dystopic instrument of enslavement and of empire? Or is it going to be something that harkens back to the spirit of its origins, of the UN Charter itself, which is a very nice charter? There's not too many problems one can have with that charter by itself. Marty, what do you think?
Great. Again, fully endorse the insights of both of you. Find them enormously valuable and important and stimulating. Before I make my own comments, I have a suggestion for both of us, and that from something you have said, Matt, and that is, as Pele pointed out, he has lacked resources, and he's a superb investigative journalist and historian, an outstanding one. Where can we find the resources? I think it may well be worthwhile approaching academic institutions and the government, specifically in South Africa, to do research on this, possibly even jointly with us, either as a group or with the podcasts we are running, and look to discuss this with people there. And there, incidentally, is precedent for this, because the great African leaders of this era reached out to great Western intellectuals who embraced them. John Kennedy appointed as his ambassador to India, the most outstanding ambassador America has ever had in India, John Kenneth Galbraith, the great economist from Harvard. And Nehru thought the world of him. They were close personal friends. And had Kennedy lived, a genuinely democratic US-Indian alliance was definitely being developed. Nehru, too, was devastated by President Kennedy's death. This is extremely important. And in Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah appoints as the head of his university, the main university in Ghana, an Irish Republican intellectual, one of the great Irish intellectuals and political philosophers of the century, who I knew very well personally. He was a great man to drink with, Conor Cruise O'Brien.
Oh my God, yeah.
Now, the cruiser, of course, in later years, and this is the reason you're rightly laughing, Pele, became an arch reactionary. He went from being a champion of African nationalism and freedom for the peoples of Africa, and he was never a racist. His adopted son, who was deeply close to him all his life, African-American, a very eminent gentleman, and like his father, very successful and constructive and important. But the cruiser in is domestic politics in Ireland. So, of course, Irish politics always drive everybody insane, especially we, the Irish, ourselves. But he was an example of how unracist the great African leaders of the time were. Now, this division runs down the middle of the British Conservative Party and the British royal family, and it's very important to identify it. And nobody does anymore. It's totally forgotten. In the
Martin, did you know Conor Cruise O'Brien? Had you met him? Have you met him?
I knew him very well. We were friends.
Really?
I was introduced to him by my then boss at UPI, John O'Sullivan. There are two John O'Sullivans. Our good liberal John, progressive John O'Sullivan from TNT days, you will recall, Pele. But the old John O'Sullivan, very dear friend to me, and I was his chief of staff at United Press International for years, and before that wrote for him for a decade at National Review. And he was a very intimate friend, very close personal friend all their lives with the cruiser. And through him, there were many evenings I would be drinking with him and Conor Cruise and his wife at the Jefferson Hotel on 16th Street in Washington, D.C. And there are many stories to be told by that. The cruiser, apart from anything else, had a fanatical hatred by the end of his life, above all people, Thomas Jefferson. Oh. And the reasons why were very interesting, but it was very entertaining. It was as if they were blood foes. I mean, he hated Jefferson more than Aaron Burr hated Alexander Hamilton. It was very funny and very bizarre. So there is that. But if you go back to the 1960s, Harold Macmillan decolonizes Africa with the aid of his colonial secretary at the time, who he wants to be his successor as prime minister, and he's very open about this. The most brilliant intellect in the Conservative Party, Ian MacLeod, who eventually becomes Chancellor of the Exchequer and basically number two to Edward Heath before he dies in 1970-71. And incidentally, no one has ever looked into the death of MacLeod. It was probably from natural causes, but it may not have been, because again, it was a very sudden and unexpected death, and he was only in his early 50s at his time and was in a position of great eminence. But he would have been prime minister in 1963, except for the reason you gave already, Pele. The Churchill, Sandys, Rhodesia-loving, white racist, which Churchill always totally was towards all Asian and black peoples. And Arab peoples too. He wasn't anti-Semitic. He was very philo-Semitic towards the Jewish people in Israel, but he was a racist in the deepest dye in every other respect. And they hated MacLeod for decolonizing Africa and deliberately blocked him. And that is the reason Ian MacLeod did not become prime minister more than any other reason in 1963. It is crucial. And he was loyal to Macmillan. But you have brought up another crucially important figure, Alec Douglas Hume. And Alec Douglas Hume has an enormously significant and consistent role in British foreign policy and history for 40 years. He is first one of the arch appeasers of Hitler as the number two man to Lord Halifax in the Foreign Office in 1938. He is one of the architects and advisors of the Munich Agreement. And what he wants at the time is Nazi Germany to destroy the Soviet Union, with Britain standing
We're talking
aside.
about Alec Douglas Home, the prime minister?
Yes, we are.
Yeah.
We are. Indeed, we are. Then in 1945, after being out of favor for 7 years, because under Churchill, at least it's evident to the British people that Hitler is the embodiment of racism and evil, and the British people are genuinely superior to that. But how does Douglas Home restore his political fortunes? He attacks the Yalta Agreement in 1945 as a sellout to Stalin. And Churchill even jokes about this at the time. Churchill says in 1938, Douglas Home and Chamberlain were the appeasers, and I was attacking them in order to stand up to Hitler. Now they accuse me of being an appeaser of Stalin, and they claim they are standing up for democracy against Stalin. He becomes prime minister in 1963 because the old establishment supports him, and nobody expects it. He has since become a sainted figure on the right, though he has literally no achievements to his name. His economic record is a catastrophe, and it's all blamed on the Labour government in 1964, which is certainly incompetent beyond dreams in its own time. But they inherit a nightmarish situation from Douglas Home and his alcoholic sword of a corrupt finance minister, Reginald Maudling. And then he becomes Edward Heath's foreign secretary for 4 years, from 1970 to 74. And of course, while pretending to work for a settlement in Rhodesia, which will later become Zimbabwe, he actually blocks it very effectively. He actually blocks it very effectively. The settlement is only reached by, of all people, Margaret Thatcher and her foreign secretary, Lord Carrington, who finally remove a 20-year embarrassment from Britain and recognize reality, because Margaret Thatcher was tough and ruthless and a right-winger, utterly ruthless, but she was also an arch realist. I think in large part because she had been trained and actually had worked successfully as a successful scientist in not original research, but applied research. She was responsible for bringing soft whipped American ice cream into Britain, for which I still thank her. Right. But Douglas Hume's true role from 1938 all the way through to the 1970s is a very dark and destructive and contemptible role. And he has been given a free hand ever since. A free hand ever since.
So he could be the villain then, or to bring back to Hammarskjold,
Very, very much. But there is one other irony, the division in the royal family. The Queen likes the new African leaders personally. She embraces them. And even 20 years later, she is still thinking the world of Julius Nyerere and other African leaders who regularly come to Commonwealth conferences. She actually believes the hypocritical, empty lies that the Foreign Office puts out, that we really do mean well for the people of Africa. But bless her, she really believes it. And she treats these leaders with dignity and warm personal friendship all her life. And so does King Charles all his life. But Prince Philip and the Queen Mother, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, the widow of King George VI, the Queen's mum, are unabashed racists who openly despise black leaders repeatedly. And this is common knowledge in British journalistic circles in the 1970s and 80s. Very common knowledge, and everybody knew it. And it was always joked about in Private Eye, for example, the satirical magazine. But the jokes, because they're jokes, delivered as jokes, historians and quote-unquote scholars and pundits don't take them seriously. But they reflected what all the journalists who fed Private Eye its unmatched intelligence and accurate political coverage at the time knew to be the truth. So this division even ran down the middle of the royal family.
I was going to ask you, Martin, sorry, I don't want Matt to get in the way. The Conor Cruise, I mean, I remember him in the 1980s as he wrote a column for The Observer, and I thought, what a beautiful stylist, like yourself, Martin.
He was a world figure, and he wrote books. He wrote a biography of Edmund Burke that's just a joy.
So I thought of him as an old man. I only knew of him, but then he turns up in the Hammarskjold story.
Oh yeah,
because he wrote from Katanga and back from here to Katanga or something, because he was the UN's representative in Elizabethville.
Yes.
And he got on the wrong side of the rebels, and one of the reasons why Hammarskjold had to go down there was that they started the Francophone rebels started to issue threats to people like Conor Cruise O'Brien, and the British of course hated him because they thought of him as a socialist, and Conor Cruise O'Brien knew, he said that something's going to happen. If Dag goes down to Ndola, it's not going to end well. So he offered to go in his place and then really tried to dissuade him from going, almost like he had a sixth sense. Yeah.
Yes. But also there's a parallel to that. And again, I think it comes down to the great sixth sense we Irish have. Because Daniel Patrick Moynihan warned President Kennedy against going to Dallas. And after Pearlie Harvey Oswald was arrested and blamed for the murder, Moynihan, who was a very significant figure in the Kennedy administration at the time, pleaded and warned in vain for Oswald to be immediately taken into federal custody and removed from the police station in Dallas and from the local police immediately. Because he said, I grew up in Hell's Kitchen in New York around 42nd Street, which then was, Gangs of New York. And then in the DiCaprio movie, it was still as bad 100 years later until they built the bus terminal, which I have used so often coming in from New Jersey since. But for growing up, Senator Moynihan recognized police stations not as the middle class see them, as places of safety, but in America at least, as places of extreme danger, where you could be hanged or shot or raped by the cops themselves, and oft perfectly casually, with complete disregard. And he recognized the danger to Oswald and the importance of keeping Oswald alive, but nobody listened to him because he was the only guy in the Kennedy administration, being Irish and being from New York City and being from Hell's Kitchen, who had the street smarts to recognize the danger, and he wasn't listened to. And the cruiser was the same. The cruiser had an uncle who was killed fighting for the British Army in World War I, and another uncle who was shot by the British Army for being not even one of the Easter Rising leaders, but for trying to prevent the British massacring the Easter Rising leaders. His other uncle was shot out of hand. So the uncle who was shot out of hand became a national hero in Ireland, and the poor uncle who died fighting for the British Empire became an unperson in Ireland. But the cruiser learned from this the dangers and ironies of political life, that being an eminent political figure and leader does not protect you. It endangers you and puts you in the crosshairs of the sights of a lot of dangerous people.
I was just going to say, one last thing about the Irishness. I mean, you must have been about 10 or 12 when the Congo crisis happened. You must be, I think, my uncle's age. My uncle said he was listening to the radio all through the night because it was the news story. The Congo story was out of all proportion to anything. I mean, you think it was like the story that everyone listened to, and these UN soldiers there, and there were the two most prominent European contingents were the Irish and the Swedes. So
yes,
Congo occupies an equally outsized space in post-war Swedish life, if you like, as it does in Ireland. It's one point of contact between Ireland and Sweden is that they both have the Congo crisis in common. So I remember, I mean, the Sweden being neutral and Ireland, I mean, they were both down there because they were both neutral countries. So I'm wondering whether you have memories or and you grew up, whether they talked about the Irish UN contingent down there and whether that was an important story or memory.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I went to a wonderful grammar school in Britain, in Belfast. Northern Ireland, maybe Scotland too, but certainly Northern Ireland was about the only part of Britain that the Labour government of the 1960s and even the Heath government of the 1970s, they destroyed higher education for teenage kids in Northern Ireland. And not Northern Ireland, across Britain, it was preserved in Northern Ireland. And I was a beneficiary of this. And I and my friends, I wasn't alone or a freak. We would go out, we would chase the girls, we would get drunk. We were chasing the girls in vain because we were too young to know how to do it. But we also talked politics, and we had excellent television coverage from a vastly superior and freer BBC then than anyone in Britain today can possibly imagine. And there was much more. I mean, John Pilger was writing in the biggest circulation newspaper in Britain at the time, freely, or relatively freely, I presume, the Daily Mirror. And we had access to all of this. And you're absolutely right, Pelle. And I want to also congratulate you because, again, I'm old enough to actually remember these events and the perception of them in the 60s that you describe, the Anglo-American conflicts, the Americans edging out the British, the collapse of confidence and bitter hatreds and resentment in the British imperial circles, the scapegoating of African leaders. the huge role Hammarskjold played on the world stage. I mean, I was only a teenager. I wasn't in a position of influence. I wasn't a professional newsman then. But just as a fly on the wall, as a kid, it was exactly as you said. I can confirm that as a witness. I can confirm your assessment, and I do.
Good, thanks. Okay, well, that's. But the Canadians, incidentally, Lester Pearson was the guy who actually came up with the idea of the blue helmets.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
I should have.
He was. Yeah. I don't know if he was the president of the UN General Assembly or something. The post now occupied by Baerbock. But
that's a can of worms there. Yeah. I mean, Pearson is somebody who, in my research reconstructing Canadian history, has come up playing a less than shining role in the ultimate.
Oh, you have them too. Yes.
Yeah, I mean,
we had them in Ireland as well. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, he was a Macy scholar. He was part of the Rhodes Milner operation that had taken over.
Okay.
Yeah, that was running the deep state operation. He was a prodigy of Vincent Massey. Vincent Massey was the head of the Milner Cecil Rhodes group in Canada.
Wow.
And he went to Oxford on a Massey scholarship and served that interest and just grew the entire deep state complex inside of Canada throughout his entire career. And even afterwards started promoting the Malthusian takeover, the Malthusian doctrine that global foreign policy from globalist institutions should be vectored around the new limits to growth ideas of the Club of Rome and that crowd that would, basically reward and encourage nations for restricting, population growth and things like that. And then they would be rewarded and punished inversely if they didn't abide by those remedies that figures around the Club of Rome and that ilk was promoting. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of Lester, though maybe he did a thing or two that was useful from time to time under the better influence of maybe a Dag or a JFK or something, maybe.
Yeah.
Right. But guys, this has been good. I mean, we've tipped past the hour, but we went through a lot of stuff. Pelle, your work, The Day the UN Died.
You can find it on Amazon. Just type in my name, or type in The Day the UN Died, or go to my WordPress, Pelle Neroth Taylor, or just Pelle Taylor. Yeah.
So go to the description box under this video. People can go get the book. Go to Pelle's website. Also, there's a documentary that's in the works. When is that supposed to come out?
Well, I've actually done a draft of the documentary. It's like give me some more money type of documentary. In other words,
yeah.
So it works, but it's a bit. So there's some placeholders there, and I wanted to do more interviews because I need to go to the States to do it. But it's. I'll send a link to that. It's on my WordPress site, and it's. Most people don't have 6 hours to read a book, so if it's a 1 hour, rather reasonable summary of the contents of my book and the thesis. And that's so, watch that if you want to find out more. So I really wanted to make an original contribution to the scholarship, and that's why I took in this whole Berlin thing, because no one else has it. I mean, there's a whole Hammarskjold publishing industry, but no one thinks to talk about the Berlin crisis, which was a big event going on at the time. So it's mostly focused about that.
No, it's super important, and the way that your mind was able to draw the parallel out of not treating these two things as separate, but as two parts of one story. The Congo fight, Pan-Africanism, as well as the Berlin crisis, in tandem with what JFK is fighting against.
Yeah, right.
It's a very holistic and I think very healthy way of approaching analysis, and I thank you very much for doing that. Marty, as always, it's a pleasure to listen to you as well and to go through your extremely interesting array of experiences and associations and insights. So guys, this was a blast. Thank you both. And for everybody watching, tune in for the next episode of Beyond Geopolitics.
Back as soon as possible, Matt.
Yeah.
What?
Let us have Pelle back. Let us have Pelle back as soon as possible.
We have to get Pelle to speak about Olaf Palme as well, his work on that.
Exactly. Yes, absolutely.
Let's do that. That'll be a sequel.
Okay, great. I'd love to do that. Okay, take care, guys.
Thanks. Bye, guys.
Thank you, guys.